Before we begin, if this channel finds you at the right moment, if this becomes part of how you end your day, please subscribe. New stories arrive every Tuesday and Friday, and it costs you nothing to make sure you never miss one.
A like, if tonight's story serves you well, is the kindest thing you can offer. Now, get comfortable. The fire is low and the night is long. The story is ready.
Close your eyes.
Let your body settle into the surface beneath you. Feel the weight of your arms, your legs, the gentle rise and fall of your chest. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need to be. The night is quiet and the world outside can wait. And in this stillness, in this soft, warm darkness behind your eyes, we are going to travel somewhere very far away, not just across oceans or continents, not just across centuries or millennia. We are going to travel to the very beginning of everything, before the mountains existed, before the seas had learned to move, before the sun had ever opened its eye above the horizon. We are going to go back to the moment before moments, to the place before places, to the first breath of existence itself. Let yourself go there now, gently. There is no rush. In the beginning, there was nothing.
And yet to call it nothing is not quite right, because nothing implies an emptiness, a container waiting to be filled. What existed before the world was something stranger than nothing. It was a state that had no name because there was no one yet to give names to things. It was a condition so complete, so total, that even the concept of darkness had not yet been invented, because darkness requires a contrast, requires the memory or the possibility of light.
This was before contrast, before memory, before possibility. The ancient Greeks called it chaos.
But do not picture disorder. Do not imagine a churning storm of broken things.
The word the Greeks used, chaos, meant something closer to a vast, yawning gulf. A great opening, an immeasurable space between everything that would one day exist and the moment of its existing. Chaos was not violent. Chaos was not loud. Chaos was not even dark exactly, because even darkness is something, and chaos was the resting place before something began. It was an infinite breath, held. It was the pause at the very bottom of an exhale, in the moment before the lungs decide to fill again. And in that pause, in that immense, patient, fathomless quiet, the first stirring began. No one can say exactly what caused it. Perhaps the question itself is meaningless, like asking what existed before existence. The Greek poets and philosophers who tried to describe it in later centuries reached for metaphors, for imagery, for the language of wind and water and warmth, because human minds need handles to hold on to when grasping at the infinite. But the truth, if there is a truth to such a thing, is simpler and stranger than any metaphor. Chaos simply shifted, like a sleeper turning over in the dark, like a tide reversing somewhere very deep, like the moment a dream begins to take shape from the formless fog of sleep, and something that was nothing begins to become something. The first thing that emerged from chaos was Gaia. She did not arrive the way a creature arrives stepping into a room. She did not fall or float or flow into being. She simply became. And as she became, the concept of solid ground was invented. Before Gaia, there was no such thing as a surface, a foundation, a place where something could stand or rest or take root. She was not a goddess who lived on the earth. She was the earth itself, its first expression, its deepest nature, its ancient and enduring soul. Gaia. The word itself is old beyond reckoning, older than the language that carries it. It means earth, yes, but it means something more than the dirt beneath your feet or the rock beneath that dirt. It means the ground of all things, the thing upon which everything else eventually rests, the patient, generous, enormous mother of matter itself. As Gaia settled into existence, something else happened. The act of her becoming, the establishment of a surface, of a depth, of an up and a down, created another presence almost as a consequence. Where there is earth, there must be something beneath the earth, something deeper than deep, something where even the most daring roots cannot reach. And so Tartarus came into being. Tartarus is difficult to describe because he exists at the boundary of existence itself. He is the abyss beneath the abyss, the deep beneath the deep. If you were to drop a stone from the highest peak of the highest mountain in the world, and that stone fell through the earth itself, fell through layer after layer of rock and heat and pressure, fell past every cavern and every root and every hidden seam of iron and gold, eventually, if it kept falling, it would reach Tartarus. And yet that is only a metaphor, because Tartarus is not simply a location below the earth. He is a fundamental condition. He is the absence at the heart of matter, the necessary depth without which height has no meaning. He emerged alongside Gaia the way a shadow emerges alongside a light. Not made from her, not created by her, but called into being by the same act of cosmic settling that brought her into existence. Where she was warm, he was cold. Where she was broad and present and generative, he was narrow and still and waiting. Where Gaia faced upward toward the sky that did not yet exist, Tartarus opened downward toward a bottom that could not be reached. They were the first pair, not a couple, not companions, more like the two faces of the same primordial coin, surface and depth, presence and void, the ground and the pit beneath the ground. And then came Eros. Eros is perhaps the most surprising of the first primordial powers, and the most beautiful in his purpose. We know his name. In later centuries he would become the mischievous winged boy with a bow and arrow, shooting golden darts into the hearts of gods and mortals alike, causing havoc and longing and obsession wherever he flew. But the Eros, the playful Eros, the youthful Eros, the troublemaker Eros, is a much later invention. A character that accumulated over centuries of storytelling, growing more personal, more human, more familiar with each generation of poets. The first Eros was something far older and far more vast. He was the force of attraction itself, the principle that causes things to draw together rather than fly apart. The deep pull that exists between any two things, between particles too small to see, between planets too distant to imagine, between a mother and the child she has not yet met, between a person lying in the dark and the sleep that is slowly, gently, irresistibly coming for them. Eros was the reason the universe did not simply remain chaos forever. He was the original gravity, not of mass, but of meaning, the force that makes connection possible, the deep yes at the heart of matter that allows one thing to reach toward another thing and eventually to create something new. Without Eros, there would have been no more creation. Gaia and Tartarus would have sat in silence at opposite poles of a dead cosmos, and nothing else would ever have come to be. But with Eros present, with the principle of attraction and desire and union now woven into the fabric of everything, the world could begin in earnest. From chaos, meanwhile, two more presences had emerged. The first was Erebus, darkness made into something. Not the absence of light, which is what darkness usually means, but darkness as a substance, as a being, as a presence with weight and texture and intention. Erebus was the deep darkness that lives in the spaces between things, the darkness of underground places, of deep caves, of the space beneath mountains where no light has ever reached and no light ever will. He was not frightening exactly, or at least he was not malicious. He was simply the truth of how much of existence is not illuminated, how much of the world exists in the spaces that light has not found yet. Alongside Erebus came Nyx, and Nyx was the night. But again, as with Gaia and Tartarus and Eros, the first Nyx was something older and larger than the simple fact of nighttime. She was not merely the darkness that falls when the sun goes down. She was the primordial night that existed before the sun had ever risen. She was the original condition of the sky, the vast black canvas on which everything that would later exist in the heavens would be painted. She was ancient. She was enormous. She was so powerful, so fundamental, so deeply woven into the structure of existence that even in later centuries, even after Zeus had risen to rule the universe with all his thunderbolts and divine authority, he feared her as only something truly primal can be feared, not because she would harm him, but because she was so much older than he was, so much deeper, so much more essential. Even Zeus, the king of the Olympians, would step aside when Nyx passed. She moved through existence the way genuine night moves, silently, completely, without asking permission. She was not cruel. She was not kind. She simply was, the way night simply is, the way the darkness that comes after a long day simply is, inevitable, encompassing, and, if you let it be, restful. These then were the first inhabitants of existence: Chaos, the original gulf; Gaia, the earth; Tartarus, the deep; Eros, the pull of desire and connection; Erebus, the darkness between things; and Nyx, the night that preceded all days. They did not speak to each other in words. There were no words yet. They did not look at each other. There were no eyes yet capable of that kind of looking. They existed in a kind of deep, pre-conscious awareness of one another, the way the different layers of the earth are aware of each other through pressure and heat and the slow movement of stone. And in that awareness, in that enormous, ancient, quiet coexistence, the universe prepared itself for what came next. Nyx and Erebus came together in the way that primordial powers come together, not as bodies meeting, but as principles interpenetrating, as complementary depths finding each other in the dark. And from their union came two children who would shape the experience of every living thing that would ever exist. The first was ether. Ether was the bright upper air, the luminous, shining substance that fills the highest reaches of the sky, above the clouds, above the winds, above the place where birds can fly. He was the first light, though not yet the light of the sun. He was the glow that would one day make it possible for there to be a heaven, a realm above the earth, where the divine could dwell and look down upon the world below. He was clarity and height, and the particular quality of brightness that exists at the edge of the atmosphere, where the air thins and the blue deepens toward black, and the stars are always waiting just behind the daylight. The second child of Nyx and Erebus was Hemera. Hemera was the day, and here something extraordinary happened. For the first time in the history of existence there was a cycle, because Nyx was the night and Hemera was the day, and mother and daughter moved in an eternal alternation, Nyx spreading her dark wings over the world, while Hemera rested, and then Hemera stepping forward with her brightness, while Nyx drew back. They shared a single dwelling place, the ancient poets said, a great cavern at the edge of the world, and they passed each other on the threshold of it, one going out as the other came in, never occupying the same space at the same time, their eternal rhythm becoming the heartbeat of the world. Day and night, light and dark, waking and sleeping. Even now as you lie in the quiet dark, Nyx is present. She was here before the earth had a name. She will be here long after every name has been forgotten, and her presence is not a threat. It is a gift, the gift of the pause, the gift of the interval, the gift of the deep, restoring dark that makes the light meaningful when it comes. Let her presence settle around you now. Gaia, meanwhile, had been doing what Gaia does. She had been growing. Not in the sense of a living thing growing, not the way a tree grows upward toward the sun, or a child grows taller over years. Gaia grew the way the earth grows, slowly, massively, with a patience that makes centuries feel like moments. She deepened her roots into the primordial space. She extended her surfaces outward in every direction. She developed texture and complexity, the first ridges and plains, the first hollows and elevations, the first sense that the ground was not simply flat and featureless, but had a geography, a topography, a kind of character. And in growing, Gaia began to feel the first stirrings of something that would later be called longing. She was vast. She was ancient. She was the foundation of all things. But she was alone in a way that her vastness could not fill. She was the earth without a sky, the ground without a ceiling. She was a foundation without anything built upon it, a mother without children, a world without a world above it. And so, in the way that the earliest primordial powers brought things into being, not through any deliberate act of creation, not through planning or intention or craft, but through the deep, wordless necessity of what they were, Gaia created Ouranos, the sky.
He came into being above her, the way the sky always exists above the earth, naturally, inevitably, as though the two had always been meant to be paired. He was vast and blue and limitless, and he arched over Gaia in every direction, touching her at the horizon in an embrace that had no beginning and no end. He was the first roof, the first ceiling, the first boundary above things, the place where the eye eventually stops when it looks upward and can go no further.
He was also, in that first age of the world, deeply, completely in love with Gaia. This, too, was the work of Eros, that ancient fundamental force of attraction that had been present since the earliest moments of existence. Ouranos looked down at Gaia and saw the earth entire, every ridge and hollow and broad plain of her, and was overcome by a longing so total that it shaped the sky itself. He pressed close against her. He wrapped himself around her. He rained down upon her in 1,000 different ways, with light, with warmth, with the first rains that fell into the first valleys and gathered into the first rivers. And Gaia, ancient and patient and generous as she always was, received him. Together they would create the first generation of beings powerful enough to be called divine. They would create marvels and monsters and mysteries. They would create the Titans, the first true gods, the children of earth and sky, the ancestors of everything that would later fill the world with meaning and story and beauty and terror.
But that is a story for the next part of the night.
For now, let this image rest in your mind like a stone settling into still water. The earth, the sky, arched together at the horizon, joined at every edge, breathing together in the first silence of the first world. The universe had learned how to exist, and existence in that first age was quiet and enormous and filled with a kind of peace that no word in any human language has ever quite managed to capture. Let that peace come to you now. Feel the weight of your body, still and settled. Feel the slow, even rhythm of your breathing. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to hold on to. The night is large and patient, the way it has always been, the way Nyx made it, not as an ending but as a rest. The sky is new, the earth is new. The first light has only just learned how to fall across the first surfaces, casting the first shadows, filling the first valleys with a warmth that has never been felt before, because warmth itself is a new invention. Gaia and Ouranos rest together at the edges of the world, earth and sky, ground and heaven, and between them, in the space where rain meets soil and sky bends to touch the horizon, something extraordinary is beginning. The world is about to become a family. Gaia was not a passive thing. She was never simply a surface to be walked upon, a ground to be taken for granted. She was alive in the deepest sense, alive the way the world itself is alive, with a consciousness so large and so slow that it could be mistaken for stillness. She felt everything that existed upon her. She felt the weight of the new sky pressing close and warm. She felt the first rains moving through her soil, finding the hidden channels and courses that would one day become rivers. She felt the deep, patient fire in her core, the heat at the center of things that would never go out, not in any age of the world, not in any era of any story. And she felt with a certainty that required no words and no thought that she was ready to bring forth life. The first children she made were not gods exactly. They were something older than gods, something so ancient and enormous that the gods who came later would regard them with a mixture of reverence and unease, the way you might feel standing at the base of a mountain that was old before the concept of age existed. These first children were the Hecatonchires, a name that means simply the 100-handed ones. There were 3 of them, Cottus, Briareos and Gyges. Each of them had 50 heads. Each of them had 100 arms. They were not monstrous in the way that later monsters would be monstrous. They were not malicious, not cruel, not driven by any hunger or rage that would make them dangerous. They were simply enormous in every sense of the word. Their strength was beyond measuring. Their size was beyond picturing. Each of their 100 arms could lift a mountain range. Each of their 50 heads held a mind of its own, and all 50 minds together in each single being created a consciousness so vast and so complex that it made the consciousness of ordinary creatures, even later divine creatures, seem like a single candle flame compared to a night sky full of stars. They were power, made flesh. They were the strength of the earth itself, given form. Gaia looked upon her first children and felt, as mothers have always felt, a love so complete and so immediate that it required no time to develop. They were hers. She knew them the way she knew her own depths. She brought them to Ouranos, the sky, their father, and waited. Ouranos looked upon the 100-handed ones and felt something that neither he nor Gaia had words for yet, because the emotion was too new, too sharp and too cold and too sudden. He felt fear, Not the abstract awareness that something might cause harm, but a deep, visceral, unreasoning terror that came from somewhere below thought. These children were enormous. They were powerful beyond his ability to measure. They had 100 arms each and 50 minds each, and they looked at the world with eyes that seemed to contain within them the same ancient patience that their mother contained, which meant they were not things that could be controlled or redirected or dismissed. They were the kind of beings that make rulers feel, suddenly and uncomfortably, like they are not truly in charge of anything. And Ouranos, who arched over all creation and liked to think of himself as the ceiling of the world, as the limit of things, the edge beyond which nothing could go, found that he could not bear the existence of something that seemed to have no limit. So he did something that would echo through all the ages that followed, something that would shape the destiny of his family for generation after generation, something that, in the end, would destroy him. He pushed them away, not gently, not with grief or apology or any acknowledgement of the love Gaia bore for them. He took the 100-handed ones and he thrust them back, down, into the deepest place available, into the hollow places beneath the earth, into the dark caverns where the light of even the first sky could not reach. He sealed them away. He pressed the weight of the earth itself over them, as though he could bury the fact of their existence beneath enough stone and dark and silence. And then he turned away and said nothing. Gaia felt it. Of course she felt it. She was the earth. She felt everything that happened within her depths, every shift and pressure and weight. She felt her children pressed into her own body against their will, sealed into her caverns like secrets she had not chosen to keep. She felt their confusion, which was not the confusion of minds that don't understand what is happening, but the confusion of beings who had never been given a reason to expect cruelty, and so had no framework for processing it. She felt the wrongness of it in the way that only a mother can feel wrongness, not as a concept, not as a philosophical problem, but as a pain so immediate and so specific that it changed the quality of everything. But Gaia was patient. She had always been patient. She was the ground itself, and the ground does not react quickly. The ground works slowly, over enormous spans of time, in ways that are not always visible on the surface. She absorbed the pain and she waited, and while she waited, she continued to create, because creation was her nature, and she could not stop it any more than a river can stop flowing. The next children she brought forth were the Cyclopes, 3 of them, Brontes, whose name meant thunder, Steropes, whose name meant lightning, and Arges, whose name meant bright. Each Cyclops had a single enormous eye in the center of their forehead, and in that eye lived a specific kind of genius, a creative intelligence, a craft intelligence, a deep intuitive understanding of how things could be made and shaped and forged. They were builders in the most fundamental sense. They felt instinctively the relationship between materials and forms, between the raw stuff of the world and the things that stuff could become with the application of skill and vision and heat. They were also, of course, enormously powerful. Not quite as enormous as the 100-handed ones. They had only 2 arms each, which already made them more manageable in appearance, more comprehensible. But their strength was vast, and their creative capacity was vaster still. In later ages, they would prove this beyond any doubt, forging objects that could not have come from any lesser hand. The thunderbolts of Zeus, the trident of Poseidon, the helm of Hades. the greatest divine weapons in all of creation would come from the single bright eye and the two enormous hands of these ancient, patient craftsmen. Gaia brought them to Ouranos, and Ouranos, looking upon them with that same cold and unreasoning fear, pressed them down into the dark as well. Something shifted in Gaia then.
It was not a sudden shift. Nothing in Gaia happened suddenly. She was too old for suddenness, too fundamental for the quick reactions of smaller, younger things. But a decision was forming in the deep, slow-moving consciousness of the earth, the way a glacier forms, by the accumulation of small things over a long time, until the accumulated weight becomes undeniable. She would not allow this to continue.
She had tried twice to give Ouranos children, and twice he had responded by burying them in her own body. She understood now what she was dealing with. She understood the particular shape of his fear, the fear of being surpassed, of being exceeded, of finding that the world contained things larger than himself. It was a fear she recognized, not because she shared it, but because she could feel its contours, the way you can feel the shape of a stone in the dark without being able to see it.
And she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who has understood something once and does not need to understand it again, that this fear would not pass on its own, that Ouranos would not change unless change was forced upon him, that the children sealed in her depths would not be freed unless something happened to the one who had sealed them there. She began to plan, but first she had more children to bring into the world. The third group of children that Gaia and Ouranos produced were the Titans. And the Titans were different from the 100-handed ones and the Cyclopes in a way that mattered enormously. The 100-handed ones were power. The Cyclopes were craft. The Titans were something subtler and in some ways more dangerous. They were the first beings who were recognizably divine in the way that would become familiar. They had specific domains and specific natures. They had something approaching personality. They were not simply expressions of elemental force, but individuals, each one distinct from the others, each one carrying within them a particular quality or aspect of the world. There were 12 of them, 6 male, 6 female, and the world would never be the same for their existence. The eldest was Oceanus, and he was, in the most literal sense imaginable, the ocean. Not a god who lived in the sea, not a deity who controlled the waves, but the ocean itself given divine consciousness. The great encircling river that the early Greeks believed wrapped around the entire world at its edges, connecting every shore to every other shore in an endless ring of moving water. He was deep and vast and ancient, even among his siblings, and he moved with the particular, unhurried certainty of something that has no reason to rush because it will still be here when everything else has changed. Beside him was Tethys, his sister and his partner, the goddess of the fresh waters, of the rivers and streams that flowed from the great encircling ocean into the interior of the world, where Oceanus was the vast ring of salt water at the edges of things. Tethys was the spreading network of fresh water within things, the veins and arteries of the world, the water that moved through the land and fed the roots and filled the springs. Together, Oceanus and Tethys would one day produce 3,000 sons, the river gods, each river in the world given its own divine presence, and 3,000 daughters, the Oceanids, the nymphs of springs and streams and clouds and rain. 3,000 on each side, 6,000 children from one divine pair. This is the scale at which the Titans operated. Next came Hyperion, whose name meant the one who goes above. He was the god of heavenly light, not the sun itself, not yet, but the principle of light moving through the upper atmosphere, the warm and golden quality of illumination that makes the world visible and beautiful. He was brightness as a fundamental condition of reality. He was what made it possible to see, and seeing to understand. His sister and partner was Thea, whose name meant simply the divine or the goddess. She was the goddess of sight and of the shining light of the sky, of the particular luminosity of precious things, of the way gold catches the light differently than iron, of the gleam that tells you something has value. Later it would be understood that it was Thea who gave the sun and moon and stars their power to shine, their ability to make light rather than simply be objects in the sky. The shine of things was her gift. Then came Cronus, the god of intellect, of the axis around which the heavens turned, of the deep questions that have no easy answers. He was intelligence not as cleverness, but as a fundamental orientation toward understanding, the drive that makes a mind want to know why things are the way they are, the reaching toward comprehension that would one day make human beings, his distant descendants, look up at the stars and want to understand them. His sister Phoebe was the goddess of the bright intellect, of prophetic wisdom, of the particular kind of knowing that comes not from careful reasoning, but from a deeper source, from the place where intuition meets certainty, where a thing is simply known before it can be explained. Her name meant bright or radiant, and the brightness she embodied was the brightness of sudden understanding, the illumination that comes when a truth reveals itself all at once, complete and shining. Cronus came next, and Cronus was different from his siblings in ways that would take time to become visible. He was the god of time, not time as we usually think of it, not the orderly march of minutes and hours that moves in one direction and allows for planning and scheduling and the orderly arrangement of events. Cronus was the god of an older kind of time, of deep time, of the long, slow cycles that operate beneath the surface of events, of the harvest and the passing of ages, and the turning of great wheels that cannot be hurried or reversed. He was the reaper of things, the one who understood that all things pass, that seasons end, that what rises must fall, that no arrangement of power lasts forever. He was also, of all the Titans, the one who listened most carefully to his mother. And finally among the great Titans came Rhea, great Rhea, Mother Rhea, whose name the ancient poets connected to the flowing of rivers and the ease of things that move naturally. She was the goddess of the fertile mountain wilds, of the natural world in its most generous and abundant expression, of the forests and the meadows and the high mountain pastures, where wild things lived freely and nothing was constrained. She was the mother principle made divine, not in the limited sense of a single parent, but in the largest sense, the quality of generativity itself, the impulse toward new life, the deep willingness of the world to keep producing, to keep giving, to keep offering the next thing and the next thing and the thing after that.
She was Gaia's daughter in the most complete sense. She had inherited her mother's patience, her mother's depth, her mother's capacity for love that does not diminish with time or difficulty. And she had inherited something else from Gaia, something that would prove equally important in the ages ahead, a deep and unshakable strength that did not announce itself, that did not need to be loud or sharp or forceful, but that was present in everything she did, like bedrock beneath soil.
There were others: Themis, the goddess of divine law and natural order; Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, from whom all understanding of the past would flow; Iapetus, whose name is old beyond translation; Creus, of the southern heavens. Each one a domain, each one a principle, each one a face of the world, made conscious and divine.
But it is Cronus and Rhea who matter most in what comes next. It is their story that will shape the entire age to follow, that will determine whether the world remains under the thumb of fear or opens into something larger. For now, the Titans were newborn. They were vast and powerful and full of the particular energy of beings who have just come into existence and have not yet discovered the full extent of what they are. They moved across the world, across Gaia's broad and generous surface, with the easy confidence of the first inheritors of things. The world was new, and it belonged to them, or so it seemed, in the way that the world always seems to belong to the young in the first moments, before they understand what the world actually asks of those who live in it. Ouranos watched them, and even the Titans, even these 12 divine and enormous beings who were recognizably gods, even they made him uneasy, in the way that all his children made him uneasy. He pressed them less harshly than he had pressed the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones. He did not thrust them into the earth's depths, but he watched them with those cold and calculating eyes, and he made sure that they understood, not in words, which were not yet the currency of divine communication, but in the weight of his presence and the chill of his attention, that the sky was his, and that he had not relinquished authority over anything. The Titans grew. They learned the world. They began slowly to understand what they were, and Gaia continued to plan. She reached down into herself, into her own depths, into the places where the useful things of the world are made and stored. She found there the grey flint, the sharp, reliable ancient stone that humans would one day discover and turn into their first tools and their first weapons. She worked it in the way that only the earth can work stone, slowly, with the patience of ages, with a precision that required no hands. And from the grey flint, she made the first sickle. It was a great curved blade, a harvesting blade, a blade shaped like the arc of a moon, appropriate because what it would harvest was the cruelty of the sky, the arrogance of the heavens, the particular form of fear that drives a powerful being to destroy what it cannot control. She brought the sickle to her children, the Titans, and she spoke to them for the first time in a way that was close enough to language to carry meaning. She told them what Ouranos had done. She told them about the 100-handed ones sealed in the dark. She told them about the Cyclopes sealed in the dark. She told them about the pattern of it, the way fear had driven their father to take everything she gave him and bury it rather than receive it. And she asked, "Which of you will help me end this?" The Titans looked at one another. They looked at the sickle, that grey flint curve gleaming in the new light of a new world. They looked at the sky above them, at their father, arched and vast and cold, with the specific coldness of beings who have decided that control is the only acceptable relationship with the world. 11 of the 12 said nothing, whether from love of their father or fear of him. or simply the ordinary hesitation of beings who understand that to act against the established order is to enter territory with no map. 11 of the 12 stepped back.
The 12th stepped forward, Cronus.
The god of time, the one who understood, better than any of his siblings, that no arrangement lasts forever. The one who had heard in his mother's words not just a request, but an inevitability, not just a plan, but the shape of something that was already happening, already in motion, already determined by the slow and patient logic of cause and consequence.
He took the sickle, and the age of Ouranos began to end. What happened next is one of the oldest stories in the world, so old that it existed in different forms in different places, echoing across cultures and centuries in the way that only truly fundamental stories do. Stories about the moment a son rises against a father. Stories about the moment the old order gives way to the new. Stories about the terrible cost of fear and the way that cost is always eventually paid.
But that is for the next part of the night.
For now, let the image of Cronus holding the sickle rest in your mind. The youngest of the Titan brothers, standing at the edge of a world that is about to change. Behind him, 11 siblings who step back. Above him, a father who has sealed his own children in darkness rather than face the truth of them. Beneath him, a mother whose patience has finally, after an eternity, reached its natural limit.
And in his hand, the grey flint curve, the tool that will harvest the sky.
The night that Cronus acted was not a night as we understand nights. There was no moon yet to mark it. The moon had not been established in the sky. There were no clocks, no hours, no measured intervals between one moment and the next. There was simply the distinction between the presence of light and the absence of it, between the warmth of day and the deep, primordial quiet of dark. And in the deep quiet, Cronus moved. He moved with the particular patience that was his nature. He was the god of time after all, and the god of time does not rush. He understood, in the way that only beings of his kind can understand, that the right moment for a thing is not necessarily the soonest moment, or the most dramatic moment, or the moment when urgency is highest. The right moment for a thing is simply when it is ready, when all the conditions have aligned, when the action and the moment find each other with the inevitability of water finding the lowest point in a landscape. That moment had come.
Ouranos descended toward Gaia in the darkness, as he did in every darkness, drawn by that ancient love, that pull of sky toward earth that had been in place since the first moment they had recognized each other. He came with the confidence of someone who has never been challenged, who has never had reason to look over his shoulder, who has arranged the world to his liking and has no cause to suspect that the arrangement is about to end.
He did not see Cronus waiting.
He did not see the sickle, that great curved grey flint blade held in a hand steadier than stone. And then everything changed. What Cronus did in that moment is described in the oldest sources with a directness that borders on the mythological equivalent of understatement, as though the poets who recorded it understood that the act itself was so enormous, so final, so universe-altering, that elaborate description would only diminish it. The sky was wounded by the earth's child. The old order was severed from itself. The reign of Ouranos, which had begun before the concept of beginning existed, came to an end between one breath and the next. Ouranos cried out. It was the first cry of pain in the history of existence.
the first sound made by a divine being in response to suffering, and it rang across the whole of the new world, across Gaia's broad surface and through Tartarus's lightless depths, and up into the heights of the heavens that Ouranos himself had been. The world shook with it. The first seas trembled. The first mountains, still new enough that their stone had not yet fully settled, felt the vibration move through them like a shiver. And from that cry, from that wound, from that terrible and necessary moment of severance, new things came into being. The drops that fell from the wounded sky fell into the sea, into the salt waters that surrounded the world, and where they fell, the waters began to churn and foam. And from the churning foam, across a long, slow passage of time that the gods experienced as a moment, and that mortals would later struggle to imagine, something extraordinary began to coalesce. Something shaped itself from the foam and the light and the salt and the particular energy of that first divine wound. She rose from the sea already beautiful, already fully herself, already carrying within her the full weight of what she was and what she would mean to the world. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire and beauty, not born from the union of two parents, not shaped in a womb, not crafted by deliberate design, but emerging spontaneously from the meeting of sea and sky at the moment of the world's first great transformation. She was, in some deep structural sense, the consequence of change, the beautiful thing that arises when something old ends and something new begins. The grace note at the end of a long, difficult passage of music.
She stepped onto the island of Cyprus, or perhaps onto the foam itself, which became solid beneath her feet, and she was perfect, and the world was different for having her in it.
But the world did not stop to contemplate her. The world was still reeling. The blood of Ouranos, not all of it, but some of it, the drops that fell not into the sea but onto the earth, onto Gaia's dark soil, these drops also became things. The earth received them the way the earth receives everything, without fanfare, without ceremony, with the patient absorption of something that has been receiving things since before receiving was possible. And from those drops grew beings of a different kind. The Erinyes rose from the blood of the sky. The Furies, three sisters whose names were Alecto, whose rage was unceasing. Megaera, who was jealous and resentful. And Tisiphone, who was the avenger of murder. They emerged from the earth already ancient, already purposeful, already carrying the full weight of their function, which was the pursuit of those who break the fundamental laws, who harm their own family, who swear false oaths, who commit crimes against the blood bonds that hold civilization together. They were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They were, in their own terrible way, a form of justice, the kind of justice that is older than laws, and older than courts, and older than any human system for adjudicating right and wrong. They were the reminder, written in suffering, that certain things cannot be done without consequence, that the universe itself keeps accounts, that what is owed is eventually paid. Their creation in this moment, from the wound of the sky, from the act of a son against a father, was a kind of cosmic irony that would take time to become visible, because the Erinyes would, in later ages, be invoked against those who harmed their family, and here they were, born from precisely such a harm. The world does not judge, it simply records. Also from the blood of Ouranos came the gigantes, the giants, enormous, powerful, fully armoured as though war were their natural state, and they had arrived already prepared for it. And the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, spirits of the trees from which the first weapons would one day be carved. Creation and destruction, beauty and violence, love and vengeance, all arising together from the same wound, the same moment, the same irreversible act. This is how the ancient world understood the nature of great change. Nothing significant happens cleanly. Nothing transforms without consequence. The wound that ends one age always scatters seeds that grow into the complications of the next. Ouranos, diminished and in pain, retreating to whatever remained of his former realm, did not go quietly. He cursed his children, not with the specific targeted curses of later magical traditions, not a careful invocation with defined parameters and intended outcomes. He cursed them the way the wounded sky might curse, with a prophecy which in the ancient world was not so different from a curse, because a prophecy was a truth about the future, and some truths about the future are indistinguishable from punishment. He told Cronus what was coming for him. He told him that what had been done to him would be done to Cronus in turn. That the son had overthrown the father, yes, but a son would overthrow Cronus as well. That the great wheel of divine succession had begun to turn, and the turning was not over with this one revolution, and the next revolution would put Cronus exactly where Ouranos now was. Defeated, cast down, replaced by his own child.
Cronus heard the prophecy and felt the cold of it. He was the god of time. He understood better than anyone the nature of cycles. He understood that what goes around comes around, that the patterns of the past tend to repeat themselves in the future, that the story of a father undone by a son has a terrible tendency to continue past the first generation. But understanding a thing and accepting it are different matters, and Cronus, for all his divine wisdom, chose not to accept it. He chose instead to prevent it. First, there was the matter of his imprisoned siblings. Gaia had asked for their release. She had made the sickle and approached her children for precisely this reason, so that Ouranos could be removed, and the 100-handed ones and the Cyclopes could be freed from the dark places in which they had been sealed. This had been the promise, or at least the clear implication. The act of liberation was supposed to flow naturally from the act of overthrow. But Cronus looked at his powerful siblings, at the 100-handed ones with their 100 arms and 50 heads, at the Cyclopes with their single brilliant eye, and their enormous strength and their capacity to forge things that even gods could not resist. And he felt something familiar move through him. He felt the thing his father had felt. Not the same shape of it, not the same cold and total revulsion that Ouranos had experienced. But fear, yes. The discomfort of looking at something powerful and wondering whether it could become a threat. The instinct shared across generations, across species, across the entire history of beings who have ever held power, to keep the powerful things contained rather than risk what might happen if they were free. He left them in the dark. He sealed the caverns again and turned his face away, and told himself whatever it is that beings who do wrong things tell themselves, that it was necessary, that it was temporary, that there would be a better time, that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. Gaia felt this betrayal the way she had felt the first one, with the deep, slow, enormous patience of the earth, adding it to the account that time would eventually settle.
and Cronus turned to the work of building his reign. The age that followed is called the Golden Age, and the name is not ironic. It was, by most accounts, the most peaceful and abundant era the world has ever known. Cronus ruled wisely, in his way. He was not his father. He did not rule through the cold machinery of fear, did not look at the world with the specific cruelty of Ouranos, did not actively harm what he governed. Under his reign the earth produced abundantly. The seasons, though they were not yet divided the way they would later be divided, were gentle and generous. Mortals in this age did not yet exist in the familiar sense, but the world itself was extraordinarily beautiful. The divine beings moved through it freely, and the abundant generosity of Gaia's nature expressed itself in every field and forest and flowing river. The Titans flourished. They spread across the world and found their domains and began to inhabit them with the ease of beings who have never known displacement, who have never had to wonder whether there would be enough or whether they belonged. Oceanus encircled the world in his great salt arms. Hyperion and Rhea established the rhythms of heavenly light. Coeus and Phoebe explored the depths of knowing and the heights of prophecy. Themis began to understand the principles of natural order that would later become the basis of all law. Mnemosyne gathered the threads of the past into the fabric of memory. And Cronus and Rhea ruled together at the center of it all. Rhea, let us stay with Rhea for a moment because she is one of the most important figures in this entire story, and she is one whose depth is easy to underestimate if you move past her too quickly. She loved Cronus. This is important to understand, not as a fact of political arrangement or divine convenience, but as a genuine truth of her nature. She was Rhea, the goddess of the flowing and the generous, the one who embodied the mountain wildness and the fertile abundance of the natural world. She did not do anything by half measures. She loved as the earth loves, completely, without reservation, without conditions, without the careful protections that more cautious beings install around their hearts. She loved Cronus, and she believed in him. She had watched him take the sickle and step forward when his brothers stepped back. She had watched him face the sky and do the necessary thing. She knew his capacity for courage, for decisive action, for the kind of clarity that cuts through hesitation when hesitation is not what the moment requires. And she knew, because she was Rhea, and she felt these things in her body, the way the earth feels what is within it, that he was also afraid, that the prophecy had lodged in him like a splinter, small enough to ignore most of the time, but always present, always catching when he moved in a particular direction. She hoped, perhaps, that love would be enough to soften the fear, that the children they would have together would be received with the generosity that their divine nature deserved, that the pattern would not repeat. She was wrong, but she would not know that for some time. The first child of Cronus and Rhea was a daughter. She arrived in the world with a divine wholeness that was immediately apparent, a completeness of being, a settled quality, as though she had always existed and was only now choosing to make herself visible. She was the goddess of the hearth, of the sacred fire at the center of the home, of the warmth that makes a shelter into a dwelling, and a dwelling into a place where life is possible. Her name was Hestia. Cronus looked at his daughter. He thought of the prophecy, and he opened his mouth and swallowed her whole. The act is almost incomprehensible, described flatly, and yet it was not performed in anger or in cruelty or with any pleasure. Cronus swallowed his daughter the way a person might cauterize a wound, doing a terrible thing because the alternative seems worse, acting on fear rather than love because fear was, in that moment, louder. He told himself what he needed to tell himself. He performed whatever internal mathematics allows a being to do an unconscionable thing and remain functional afterward. He swallowed Hestia, and he waited to see if the prophecy would come for him. It did not come. The thunder and the retribution did not arrive. The sky did not crack. The earth did not rise against him. Nothing happened except the ordinary continuation of the Golden Age, abundant and peaceful and beautiful as always. And so when the second child arrived, Demeter, goddess of the grain and the harvest, of the cycles of growth and death, and growth again that make life on earth possible, Cronus swallowed her as well. And when the third child arrived, Hera, who would one day be the queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage and the sacred bonds between people, majestic and powerful and proud, Cronus swallowed her too. And then Poseidon, the god of the seas and the deep waters and the earthquakes that move through the earth when the deep waters shift beneath it, swallowed. And then Hades, the god of the underworld, of the place beneath the earth where the dead go, of the invisible realm that is the other side of the living world, swallowed. 5 divine children. 5 times Rhea had brought a new life into the world, and 5 times Cronus had looked at that new life and chosen fear over love, chosen control over trust, chosen the cold logic of self-preservation over everything that Rhea was and everything she had hoped he could be. 5 times Rhea had felt the particular grief of a mother who has lost a child to something she could not fight with her hands. But Rhea was not only grief. She was, at her core, something her husband had forgotten in his fear. She was the mountain wildness, the flowing abundance, the generous and inexhaustible creativity of the natural world. She was Gaia's daughter in the most complete sense, and Gaia had shown her, in her own slow, patient, determined way, what it looks like when a mother decides that the arrangement must change. When the 6th child was coming, Rhea went to her mother. She went to Gaia in the oldest way, not by travelling, not by walking across the surface of the earth to some meeting place, but by the deeper communion that was always available to them, earth mother to earth daughter, the conversation that takes place in the quiet places where the roots go and the stone remembers. She told Gaia what had happened. She told her about Hestia and Demeter and Hera and Poseidon and Hades, swallowed, gone, held inside the body of the one who had loved their mother and betrayed his children. She told her about the grief of it, the specific and unbearable grief of loving something and losing it, not to accident or illness, or the ordinary mortality of things, but to the fear of the one who should have been its protector. And she told Gaia that this child, this 6th child coming now, she would not allow it to be swallowed. She would not sit with her arms open and her heart full and give what she loved most to the appetite of fear. Not this time. Gaia listened. And then slowly, in the way of the earth, in the way of things that have been thinking for longer than thinking has been possible, she spoke. She told Rhea what to do. She told her to go to Crete, to the island rising from the sea, with its deep caves and its wild mountains and its ancient stone. She told her to find the cave on Mount Ida, or perhaps on Mount Dicte. The sources differ, and perhaps both are true, which is the way of sacred places, and to go inside, into the dark and the deep, into the kind of place where the earth keeps its most important secrets, and to give birth there, in the hidden dark, where Cronus could not see. And she told Rhea what to do once the child was born. She told her to swaddle a stone, to wrap a large, smooth, heavy stone in the same cloth she would have wrapped a child in, to make it as much like a child as a stone can be made, and to bring it to Cronus and let him take it. It was, in its way, a fitting solution. The god of time, of harvest, of the reaping of things, fooled by a rock. The ancient earth, which had been yielding and patient and endlessly giving, yielding something hard and immovable instead, something that could not be swallowed in any meaningful sense because it had nothing inside it worth swallowing. Rhea listened, and she did exactly as her mother said. She went to Crete, to the dark cave in the wild mountain, and she gave birth in the deep hidden quiet of the earth's interior. The child came into the world in secret, wrapped in darkness and stone and the particular warmth of hidden things, attended by the nymphs of Crete, who would later be called the Meliae, the ash nymphs, the keepers of secrets, and by the Curetes, young divine warriors, who clashed their shields and spears together outside the cave to cover the sound of the infant's cries, so that Cronus would not hear and come. The child was a boy. He was small, the way all infants are small, and yet the cave itself seemed to recognize him. The walls seemed to lean in slightly. The dark seemed to have a quality of attention to it, as though the deep earth understood what it was holding and wanted to be worthy of the trust being placed in it. His name was Zeus. Rhea held him in the cave for as long as she could, breathing in the warmth of him, the particular realness of a new child, the weight and the softness and the extraordinary fact of him being alive and present, and hers in a way that her 5 swallowed children had been hers, and then were not. She held him, and she memorized him with her hands and her eyes, and every sense she had, the way mothers memorize infants as though they understand, instinctively, that children are only on loan, and the keeping of the memory is a way of keeping the child itself. Then she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth. She carried it back to Cronus, and Cronus, without looking closely, without taking the time to question, to examine, to use any of his divine perception to understand what he was being handed, swallowed it. The stone settled into him with a weight that was different from the weight of his divine children, though he did not notice the difference. Or perhaps he noticed and chose not to examine what he noticed, because examining it would require acknowledging that he had been fooled, and acknowledging that would require him to feel the thing he was most trying not to feel. He went back to ruling the Golden Age, unaware that somewhere in a cave in Crete, tended by mountain nymphs and shielded by the clash of warriors' shields, his 6th child was drinking the milk of the divine goat Amalthea, and growing, slowly, inevitably, with the patient certainty of something that knows what it is and where it is going, toward the destiny that the wounded sky had promised. Zeus grew in Crete. He grew in the way that divine children grow, not quite as mortals grow, not simply larger and heavier with the passage of seasons, but in all dimensions at once. Strength, yes, and size, but also understanding, awareness, the slow, expanding sense of what the world was and what his place in it might be. The nymphs fed him, and the curettes protected him, and the island held him, and all the while the world beyond the island continued to turn through its golden age, beautiful and peaceful, and presided over by a god who did not know that the prophecy was already in motion. He did not know that the child he had tried to prevent was already alive and learning. He did not know that the thing he had swallowed to keep himself safe was in fact a stone. He did not know that Gaia was watching and waiting, and that the account she kept was almost ready to be settled. Let the image of Zeus in the cave rest with you for a moment. The dark, the warmth, the sound of the sea outside and the clash of shields beyond the cave entrance. The divine infant sleeping in the earth's embrace, unknown to the world, protected by the deep, patient conspiracy of mothers and mountains and ancient stone. There is something in that image that speaks to something very old, the knowledge that what is most important is sometimes most carefully hidden, that the things which will change everything are not always announced, that the most significant beginnings often happen in the quiet and the dark, attended only by those who love enough to keep a secret. You are in your own quiet dark tonight, in your own small hidden place, warm and still and protected from the noise of the world outside, and something is resting in you, in the deep and patient interior of your own body and your own sleeping mind, that is gathering strength the way Zeus gathered strength in the cave. Perhaps it is a plan not yet fully formed. Perhaps it is a grief that is slowly, quietly becoming something else. Perhaps it is simply the ordinary restorative magic of sleep, repairing what the day has used and preparing what tomorrow will need. Whatever it is safe in the dark. It is held. It is growing at exactly the pace it needs to grow. Time moved differently in the age before clocks, before seasons divided themselves into the familiar four, before the sun had learned its precise arc across the sky, and the stars had settled into the constellations that would one day help sailors find their way home across dark water. Time moved the way deep things move, not in the quick, visible way of surface water, not in the urgent, forward-rushing way of rivers finding the sea, but in the slow, massive, inevitable way of glaciers, of tectonic plates, of the long grinding patience of stone against stone across millennia. And in that patient time, in the hidden cave on the wild island, Zeus grew. He grew fed by the milk of Amalthea, the divine goat, or in some accounts, the divine nymph who took the form of a goat, because the boundary between creatures and deities was permeable and various in that earliest age, before the categories had fully hardened. Amalthea was generous and warm, and her milk carried within it a richness that was not simply nourishment, but something closer to the concentrated vitality of the earth itself. Zeus drank deeply of it. He grew strong. He was attended by the Curetes, young divine warriors, their names debated across centuries of telling, their number and their nature shifting slightly from one account to the next, but their function always the same. They danced around the cave. They clashed their bronze shields together, their spears ringing against the metal in a continuous rhythmic clamour that filled the mountain air and fell back into the cave as a kind of music, wild and martial and protective, a sound that said, "There is nothing dangerous here. There is no infant here. There is only the island and the wind and the sound of warriors at their ancient practice. The sound covered Zeus's cries when he cried. The sound covered his laughter when he laughed. The sound was a wall of noise around a secret that the world was not yet ready to know. The mountain nymphs who tended him called him by name, Zeus, a name whose meaning the ancient scholars argued about endlessly, connecting it to the sky, to the light, to the fundamental concept of divine authority, the word from which we get our own word for the divine, through all its long transformations across languages and centuries. Zeus, the name that would eventually be spoken with more weight than any other name in the ancient world. He grew, and as he grew, something else was growing alongside him, a quality of awareness, of perception, of the capacity to look at the world and understand not just what was on its surface, but what was moving beneath. He understood, from the time his understanding was capable of grasping it, that his siblings were not dead, that the 5 who had come before him, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, were not gone from the world, but were held within his father, preserved in the divine suspension of a Titan's body, waiting. He understood what had been done to them. He understood why, and he understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to those who have been protected by the deep patience of their mothers and grandmothers, that the waiting had an end, and the end was his responsibility. He also understood, because Gaia had ways of making things known, in dreams and in the particular language of stone and root and deep earth that she had spoken since before language, that he would not be alone when the time came to act. The time came. How Zeus left Crete and made his way into the world beyond the cave, this too is a story told in different ways by different voices across the centuries. Some say Gaia herself guided him. Some say the island released him as naturally as a tree releases a ripened fruit at the moment of exactly the right readiness. Some say Metis was involved, Metis whose name meant wise counsel, who was one of the Oceanids, daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, and who would become the first great love and ally of the young Zeus, whose wisdom and cunning would prove as essential to what came next as Zeus's own divine strength. Whatever the path, he arrived in the world, and the world was still the golden age, still beautiful, still abundant, still presided over by Cronus and the elder Titans, still, on its surface, peaceful. But beneath the surface, in the deep places where Gaia could feel what was happening, the tensions had been building for an age. The 100-handed one still sealed in the dark, the Cyclops still sealed in the dark. Rhea's grief, still present, patient and enormous, as only a Titan's grief can be. Gaia's account, still open, still accumulating interest. Zeus moved carefully. He had his mother's patience and his grandmother's understanding of how deep things work. He did not come crashing into the world announcing himself. He came quietly. He found his way to his father's court in the way that a new thing always finds its way into an established order, at first without being recognized for what it is.
And here Metis played her part.
Metis prepared a draught for Cronus. Some accounts call it a potion. Some describe it as an emetic herb, or a combination of substances drawn from the deep wisdom of the natural world that Metis, as an Oceanid, carried within her by nature. Whatever its precise composition, its effect was understood clearly across every version of the telling.
It would make Cronus give back what he had taken.
The challenge was getting it to him. And here begins one of the oldest stories of cunning in the Western tradition, older than Odysseus, older than any of the clever mortals who would later become famous for their wit. This was a divine cunning, the kind that operates at the level of fundamental forces rather than individual schemes. Zeus disguised himself as a cupbearer, a servant of the divine court, one of those whose function was to bring food and drink to the gods at their table, so ordinary and so expected that the eye slides past them without truly seeing. He walked into the presence of Cronus, and he poured the draught into his father's cup with a steady hand. And Cronus drank. What followed is described in the myths with a blunt physicality that is both startling and somehow exactly right. Cronus, the god of time, the lord of the golden age, the ruler of all creation, wretched, the divine body rejecting what it had wrongly consumed, the deep instinct of biology overriding the will of even a titan, the undeniable grammar of the body saying, this was not meant to be kept. The stone came first, the smooth, heavy stone that Rhea had wrapped in swaddling cloth and offered to Cronus in place of the child he feared. It landed on the earth at a place that would later be called Delphi, the navel of the world, and it would remain there for ages, a monument to the particular combination of grief and cunning and necessity that had shaped the first moment of Zeus's survival. A reminder, in stone, of what had been done and what it had cost and what it had made possible. And then came the gods, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Poseidon, Hades, one after another, emerging from the divine interior of their father into the air of the world, blinking into the light of an existence they had not yet truly experienced. They were not weakened by what had happened to them. They were not diminished. If anything, the time held within their father had been a kind of preservation. They had been held at the edge of their becoming, and now they became all at once, stepping fully into themselves with the accumulated energy of the time they had waited. They looked at Zeus, their youngest brother, who had never been swallowed, who had grown in the wild mountain cave, who had returned for them. He was not yet what he would become, not yet the father of gods and mortals, not yet the lord of thunderbolts and divine authority. He was still young by the measure of divine lives. But he had done this, and they understood what it meant. Something shifted among them, in the wordless way that truth shifts among people who are paying attention. An alignment, a recognition, the beginning of a bond that no subsequent conflict would ever fully sever. But they had no time to rest in the warmth of reunion, because Cronus knew now what had happened, and the elder Titans knew, and the age that had been golden was about to become something else entirely. Cronus called his siblings to him, the elder Titans, those who had ruled alongside him through the long, peaceful centuries of the Golden Age, and the Titans, most of them, came. They had been part of the order that Zeus and his siblings were now threatening, and the logic of self-preservation, of loyalty to the established, to the familiar, to the world they had known and ruled together, was not a small thing. They gathered on Mount Olympus, the great Titan mountain in the south of the world, and they prepared for what was coming. Zeus and his siblings needed allies. They were powerful, genuinely, essentially, divinely powerful, each in their own domain. But the elder Titans were powerful too, and numerous, and they had the enormous advantage of knowing the world as it was, having moved through it since the beginning, understanding its terrain in a way that the younger gods were only beginning to learn. Zeus went to Gaia, again as Rhea had gone to Gaia, as the daughters and sons of the earth had always gone to the earth when they needed to understand what could be done and how it might be done. He went to the deep and the ancient and the patient, and he listened. And Gaia told him where the real power was hidden. She told him about the Tartarus, the deep below the deep, the abyss beneath the earth, where his grandfather Ouranos had sealed the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones in the first age of the world, and where Cronus had kept them sealed when he had the chance and the reason to free them and chose not to. She told him that those imprisoned beings, those enormous, ancient, extraordinary first children of earth and sky, were still there, still waiting, still holding within them the strength and the craft and the particular quality of being that made them capable of things no other being in all of creation could match. She told Zeus to free them. He descended down through the layers of the earth, through the soil and the stone and the heat of the deep interior, down past the places where even the deepest roots do not reach, down into the lightless caverns where time itself seemed to move differently, slower, thicker, with the quality of something that has been waiting so long it has forgotten how to move at any other pace. He found the Cyclopes first. They were vast and still in the dark, those three great craftsmen, Brontes, Steropes, Arges, their single eyes closed or open. It was hard to tell in the lightlessness, their enormous bodies having adapted over the ages to the unchanging dark of their confinement in a way that suggested they had not given up, had not despaired, had simply entered a state of patient waiting that was the divine equivalent of sleep. Zeus brought light to them, not the light of the sun had not yet been established in its full glory, but the light of divine presence, that illumination that comes from the nearness of something genuinely powerful. And the Cyclopes opened their eyes, and they saw him. He told them who he was. He told them what had happened in the world above, the overthrow of Ouranos, the rule of Cronus, the swallowing of his siblings, his own hidden birth and hidden growing. He told them that the being who had kept them here, who had chosen to leave them in the dark rather than honor the promise of their liberation, was the same being who was now preparing to fight for the continuation of his rule. And he told them he was here to take them out of the dark, not to use them, not to trade one captivity for another, but to give them back the world they had been stolen from. He freed them, and then he descended further into the deeper dark to find the 100-handed ones. Cottus, Briareos, Gyges, the three enormous beings who had been the first children of Gaia and Ouranos, whose 50 heads and 100 arms were so far beyond ordinary comprehension that even the other primordial beings had regarded them with a kind of awe. They had been in the dark longer than any other living thing. They had been here since before the Titans existed, since before the idea of rule and power and dynasties of divine beings had taken shape. They had been here since the very first cruelty, the very first act of a powerful being suppressing what it feared. Zeus stood before them in the dark and spoke to them as an equal, which was either very brave or very wise or both, because in terms of raw power, they were not equals. The 100-handed ones could have crushed Zeus without particular effort. They could have regarded his offer of liberation with suspicion or resentment or the particular bitterness of beings who have been promised things before and received the opposite. Instead, they listened, and what they heard in his voice was something they recognized, something they had not encountered since the moment of their creation, when Gaia had first looked upon them with the complete and unconditional love of a mother. What they heard was the voice of someone who saw them clearly, all their 100 arms, all their 50 heads, all their enormous and excessive and world-exceeding power, and did not flinch, did not step back, did not revise his regard for them downward because of what they were.
He freed them too.
And the Cyclopes, grateful beyond any ordinary expression of gratitude, did what Cyclopes do. They made things. They went to their forges, those ancient craftsmen, and they worked with the furious, concentrated energy of beings released from confinement after an eternity. And they made gifts for the children of Cronus and Rhea. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt, the lightning in a form that could be thrown, the concentrated electrical fire of storms compressed into a weapon of absolute divine authority, crackling and bright and terrifying and irresistible, the thunderbolt that would become the symbol of Zeus's power throughout all of history, that would be painted on his palm and carved into his temples and invoked by his name across every culture that came into contact with the idea of him. For Poseidon, they made the trident, the three-pronged spear of the deep waters with which he could strike the ocean floor and raise waves that swallowed coastlines, or drive it into the earth and split mountains with the force of the resulting shockwave. A weapon that was also an instrument, that could create as well as destroy, that understood the deep relationship between water and earth, that Poseidon himself would come to embody. For Hades, they made the helm of invisibility, a cap of darkness forged from the substance of the deep and crafted with the understanding of the Cyclopes, who had, after all, spent an eternity in the dark and knew its properties more intimately than anyone, that rendered its wearer completely invisible, not just to the eye but to all perception, as though the wearer had stepped outside the field of what could be known. 3 gifts, 3 weapons of the divine world, forged in gratitude and given freely, from craftsmen who had been in the dark for an eternity to the beings who had brought them back into the light. Now the war could begin. It lasted 10 years. 10 years by the counting that would later be used by mortals, though in the divine realm the duration was felt differently, not as the accumulation of days and seasons, but as a sustained condition, a continuous state of upheaval and effort, and the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting something that does not simply yield. The war was called the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and it was fought across the whole of the created world, from the peaks of the highest mountains to the floors of the deepest seas, and its reverberations were felt in the earth and the sky and the air and the water, in every element of the world simultaneously. The Titans held Mount Olympus, the Olympians, as Zeus and his siblings were beginning to be called, though they did not yet have their mountain, held wherever they could find and hold, striking and withdrawing and regrouping with the strategic flexibility of beings who did not have the advantage of established position, and so had to compensate with speed and cunning and the willingness to fight differently than their enemies expected. It was brutal, and it was magnificent, and it was terrible in the way that all wars of fundamental necessity are terrible, not because the participants are evil or because the cause is wrong, but because the cost of the thing is always higher than anticipated, and the world that exists on the other side of such a conflict is always different from the world that entered it, and not all of those differences are improvements. The 100-handed ones fought alongside Zeus and his siblings, and they were, as they had always been, beyond anything the world had previously produced. Each of them could hurl 300 boulders simultaneously, one from each of their 100 arms, 3 volleys at once, a continuous avalanche of stone and force that fell upon the Titan positions on Mount Olympus, like a sustained and terrible storm, like the mountain itself was being dismantled and thrown back at its defenders, one piece at a time. The Titans had power, deep, enormous, ancient power, the accumulated divine authority of the beings who had ruled since the age before Zeus was born. But they had not anticipated what the 100-handed ones could do. They had not planned for it, had not built their defences with it in mind, because they had assumed, as Cronus had assumed since the beginning, that those great imprisoned beings would remain imprisoned. The assumption had been wrong. Mount Olympus shook, then it cracked. Then, under the sustained assault of the 100-handed ones and the thunderbolts of Zeus and the deep water pressure of Poseidon and the strategic invisibility of Hades moving through their ranks unseen and unknowable, the Titan stronghold fell. The Titans fell one by one. Not all of them, because this is important, because the story is not simply a story of good destroying evil, of the young gods annihilating the old. Many of the Titans had not fought at all. Oceanus had remained apart, unwilling to take sides in a war between generations, maintaining his endless circuit of the world with the steady disengagement of something too old and too vast to be moved by the particular conflicts of his time. Themis, the goddess of natural law, had similarly held back, understanding perhaps that natural law does not take sides in the way that armies do. Prometheus and Epimetheus, the sons of Iapetus, had sided with Zeus, understanding where the future was tending and choosing to be part of it. But the core of the Titan army, those who had answered Cronus's call, who had fought from Mount Olympus through all 10 years of the war, these fell. And Zeus knew what to do with them, because he had been guided by Gaia, and Gaia understood the deep architecture of the world. He sent them to Tartarus, not the darkness of simple imprisonment, not the caverns that had held the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones. Tartarus itself, the genuine abyss, the place beneath the place, the true deep that made even the deepest caverns seem shallow by comparison. He surrounded it with bronze walls, forged by the Cyclopes in the same creative frenzy that had produced the thunderbolt and the trident and the helm. He set the 100-handed ones as guardians at the gates, because who better to guard a prison than those who had experienced what imprisonment at the hand of these same Titans had meant? And he sealed it. The elder Titans descended into the dark that had no end, Cronus with them, the god of time, sealed away from time, the harvester of things, prevented from harvesting anything more, the one who had swallowed his children to prevent the fulfillment of a prophecy, arriving at exactly the fulfillment of the prophecy because of the very actions he had taken to prevent it. The war was over. The world was changed. Mount Olympus, the Titan stronghold, was broken and scattered. Where it had stood, the evidence of the conflict remained in the altered landscape, the cracked earth and the new coastlines, and the mountains that had been moved or shattered or pushed into new configurations by the force of 10 years of divine warfare. And the Olympians, victorious and exhausted and alive in a way that victory makes you feel alive, stood in a world that was entirely theirs to understand. There was one more thing to do, one more ancient wrong to right, one more debt that the long account of Gaia's patience had been waiting to see settled. Atlas. Atlas was a titan, the son of Iapetus, one of those who had fought against Zeus through all 10 years of the war. He was not sent to Tartarus because his punishment was different in kind, and the difference was instructive. He was condemned to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky on his shoulders. The sky, the same sky that Ouranos had once been, before he fell, now made into a burden carried on the shoulders of the defeated forever. Some accounts describe this as a punishment devised in anger. Others suggest it was a recognition of something more structural, that the sky needed to be held up, that the separation of earth and sky which had been established in the earliest age of the world needed to be maintained by something other than the automatic fact of Ouranos' existence, and that Atlas, strong beyond almost any other being, was simply the most qualified candidate. Perhaps both are true. In the ancient world, necessity and punishment were often indistinguishable. The war was over. The Titans were imprisoned. The world was ready for something new. But the new world needed to be organized. The victory had created a vacancy, not just in who ruled, but in how everything was arranged. The seas and the skies and the depths and the surface and the spaces in between all needed stewards. The domains of creation needed gods to inhabit them, to understand them, to be responsible for them. Zeus and Poseidon and Hades drew lots.
It was the fairest method available, the simplest and most ancient form of the principle that those who share equally in risk should share equally in reward, and that the distribution of that reward should not be determined by the will of any single person or the argument of any single claim, but by the impartial turning of chance. 3 lots, 3 domains. Zeus drew the sky. He became the lord of the upper air, of the heavens, of the bright and thunderous region above the earth, where storms were born and lightning moved, and the divine authority over all of creation was established. He became what his name had always suggested he would become, the one who goes above, the one who sees all, the ruler.
Poseidon drew the sea, the great encircling waters, the deeps and the shallows, the waves that moved under the wind, and the currents that moved beneath the waves, and the earthquakes that happened when the ocean floor shifted in its sleep. He became the lord of everything that was water and everything that water touched, which was, eventually, everything. Hades drew the underworld, the realm beneath the earth, darker than Tartarus but distinct from it, not a prison exactly, or not only a prison, but a kingdom, a vast and silent kingdom, where the dead went when they were finished with the living world, where they wandered in the pale light of a sun they could not feel, tended by the quiet administration of a god who had drawn the most solemn domain of the 3 and accepted it with the particular dignity of someone who understands that someone has to do the important things, even the somber ones. The earth, Gaia herself, was held in common. She belonged to all of them, as she had always belonged to all her children and all her descendants, as she would always belong to all the living things that walked upon her surface and sank their roots into her soil and drank the water that flowed through her depths. And the great mountain, the mountain that would become the seat of divine authority, the home of the Olympians, the axis around which the new order would organize itself, was Mount Olympus, rising in the north, above the clouds on its highest peaks, above the weather that moved through the world below, into the clear, still air where the light was always gold, and the view extended to every horizon simultaneously. This would be their home. This would be the place from which the age that came next would be governed, the age of the Olympians, the age that produced the stories that still live in us, that still give us the vocabulary for beauty and desire and justice and war and love and death and transformation, the age we still call simply the age of gods.